Hello, and thank you for joining us. Today, we will be speaking with Margaret Owen OBE. Margaret is a barrister specializing in women's human rights. She has previously worked as an immigration and asylum lawyer, as head of the Law and Policy Division of International Planned Parenthood Federation, and as a consultant to various United Nations organizations. She founded the first international organization to address human rights issues in the context of widowhood, and is now the president of the WPD, or the Widows for Peace Through Democracy, which is the umbrella for many partner organizations across the world. She is also a founding member of GAPS UK, the Gender Action on Peace and Security, and she is a regular participant at the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women and has been a consultant on widowhood to the UN. Margaret, thank you very much for speaking with us.
It's lovely to be here and to be interviewed by you, Connor. I'm a great admirer of the way you ask your questions.
Well, thank you. We are all a great admirer of your work as well. I first wanted to ask you a bit about your background, when and why you began working in the area of widowhood. You have spoken elsewhere about the impact that the death of your late husband had on raising the issue for you. But I wanted to ask you, in addition to this, what other issues and developments were taking place that led you to focus on this issue, and what the purpose of the organization was when it was founded.
Well, I think always, even when I was a child, I've thought about justice and equality, even as I grew up as the two older brothers and all the things that my brothers could do and I couldn't do, although my mother had also been a great fighter. And my mother came from an immigrant poor family. And in the First World War, she managed to get a classic scholarship to Cambridge and changed to medicine in the middle of the First World War, coming from a really poor immigrant family. So she's been a great influence on me. And my father was a lawyer. Also, we didn't really talk about human rights, but he was a sort of human rights lawyer himself. He was on Hitler's blacklist. He did a huge amount to try and save people from the terrible things that were going on in Germany. And then I didn't know, I half wanted to be an actress or a barrister. And I went to Cambridge and read law and saw myself as a sort of Portia, from Merchant of Venice. The quality of mercy is not strained. It floweth as the gentle rain from heaven. And so I went to the bar. And it was a very difficult time for women at the bar. I'm now in my 90th year, so this was in the early 50s. So it was quite hard being at the bar when it was very misogynist in a way. It was really very, very difficult. And in fact, I gave up after a few years and left the bar and did completely different things. And then I went back to LSE. I went actually into television and began to make documentaries, which are also about human rights. And then as you said, I became an immigration asylum lawyer. I got involved when the Ugandan Asians were kicked out of Uganda by Amin and began to work on the rights of asylum seekers and immigrants. And anyway, and then, as you said, I went into International Planned Parenthood Federation as head of law and policy. And that's interesting because I lost my job there in the early 1980s when Reagan cut all the aid for contraception, family planning to UNFPA and IPPF. And it's odd because it's happening all over again when this country has just halved its aid budget, or rather gone from 70% to 5%, which I think is actually unlawful. But they've also cut assistance for family planning, which is going to cause the deaths of millions of women. But all the time that I was at IPPF and I'm dealing with the status of women and the rights of women to have control over their own fertility and their own bodies, I never for one moment thought about widows, ever. Although I was looking at their rights to be able to control the number of children that they wanted, their rights in marriage and so on. And then 31 years ago, my husband died, and I was actually at the time teaching judicial administration to magistrates and judges from Commonwealth countries. And the extraordinary thing was that one of them had a very sick baby, and I bought from Malawi, and I invited that woman to come with her baby to England because I was able to get her into a hospital in the country where I knew the pediatrician. And she walked into my London house before she even sat down with her sick baby, looked round the room and said, "And you mean your husband's brothers let you stay here and keep all these things?" Well, I was about to go as visiting professor to the UCLA, the School of Public Health at the University of Los Angeles, and that rang in my head as I crossed the Atlantic. I began to think I did know something about it. It echoed something I knew from all my travels in Africa and South Asia. And that's how I began to explore. Nobody was even there at the UCLA when I looked up in their archives. I think we'd hardly got the internet in those days. There was a bit about Sooty in India, a bit about Christian missionaries working with poor widows. And that was just before the Fourth World Conference for Women that was held in Beijing. And I went to there. I was covered by the Commonwealth Secretariat, and I went to Beijing, and that's where I convened the very first international workshop on widows, because it was extraordinary. It was just extraordinary. Nobody had been talking about it before. And they're barely talking about it now, 27 years later. Although widows, particularly in South Asia, in Africa, in parts of the Middle East, even in parts of Latin America, all over the world, widows are the poorest of the poor, and it is the most neglected of all gender and human rights issues, particularly now in what we call fragile and conflict-afflicted countries, fragile countries, where wars, of course, what do wars do? They create the widows. They don't just create millions of widows of all ages, but they also create what we call now the half-widows. These are the wives of the forcibly disappeared or abducted. But in so many of these countries, we have what's called pluralism. We have parallel systems of law in which you have modern reformed laws, maybe laws that actually on paper comply with international conventions like the UN Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the CEDAW, but also modern laws that are there to implement the extraordinary document that came out of the Beijing conference, which is called the Beijing Platform for Action. It has 26 action areas on everything to do with health, access to education, to employment, violence against women, institutional mechanisms, the rights of women to be in decision-making. And all these countries on the whole, on paper, they've signed up to it. But in these countries where I talk about pluralism, you have that system of law on paper, and then you have the incredibly discriminatory, misogynist interpretations of religion and custom and tradition, which actually bar widows from any other life except as chattels. They are actually stigmatized. They can be in some of these countries, there are mourning and burial rights, which are absolutely appalling, where a widow can be inherited by a husband's brother or cousin, where she's not allowed to inherit land. She can't own land, or she's subject to the most appalling rituals, which are really like torture. But most of all, she is often, particularly in rural areas, illiterate, doesn't even know what on paper are the rights that she had. And she is now in conflict countries. Often widows are almost the dominant population in IDP and refugee camps. And I'm talking to you, Connor, because we're going to come back all the time as much as we can to what is happening now for the Kurds under the terrible things that are going on, not just in Turkey, but in Syria and in Iraq. And of course, the Kurds are suffering terribly in Iran as well. But when I think about Rojava, the wonderful, wonderful Rojava, where I wish I was there now, if only I could get there now, but I'm afraid I'm not allowed into Turkey, and I can't get to Rojava without getting into Turkey, and I'm not allowed there now. But there they've got the camps, like Al-Hol camp, and there the Kurds, and many, many, many of those women in the camps are widows. Maybe they are brides of fighters, they are brides of jihadists, they're brides of ISIS. But whoever they are, whatever they are widows, and they have no rights at all. And it's absolutely essential that we actually prioritize this issue, because I now, and I wish that I could, Ocalan, I've just been reading all afternoon the works of Abdullah Ocalan that he's writing in prison about the status of women. And he doesn't actually say much about widows, but he's talking about the rights of women. But it's really now the widowhood issue, when there are so many millions of widows who are so poor that it's the key driver of taking girls out of school and putting them into early marriage, and in many countries into FGM, and boys into madrasas, into boy soldiers, into crime. So it's not a sort of what you'd like to say, women's issue on the side. But Ocalan has never said that women's issues. He said they're absolutely central because they affect the whole of society. And the widowhood issue really does affect the whole of society, its future and its peace, because widowhood is a root cause of extending and expanding poverty and inequality through the children who are not in school across the generations. And that is what fuels future conflict. So we can't have a sustainable peace unless we address the rights of widows. And we also want widows to have their voices heard at tribunals, if there's any accountability for the war crimes and the genocides that are going on. Because the widows are the survivors, kill the men and boys, rape the women and girls. So who is left to give testimonies? And we've seen that in Rwanda. We saw that in the Balkan Wars as well. The need to actually protect and support women like widows so they can say in a tribunal without any stigma what happened to them. So it's a very, very important issue, and we have to dispel the myth that widows are mainly elderly women who are respected by their families and looked after, because it's not true. And there are millions and millions of women or girls who are child widows. You could be a widow when you're 3 or 4 with child marriage. And many, anyway, of older widows have been widows since they were children all their lives. So you can see why I'm passionate about this and very conscious that I, as a widow, live in a country where I had a pension. I had no stigma attached to me. Okay, socially, it might have been slightly different from being married, but I had an education to go on working, and I'm very, very lucky. And therefore, it's my passion to try and get widowhood on the international agenda. And the terrible thing is that this March, every year for the last 27 years, I've been going to New York to the Commission on the Status of Women, trying to get widows into that agreed conclusion. And even this year, when it was virtual, although all the African countries, my own UK government supported us, that we have to get widows into that agreed conclusions. It has to be addressed. In the end, it's out, not a single mention of widows. So one is appalled. But anyway, sorry, a rather long answer to your question, but I'm passionate about that because, as I say, it is scandalous that it should be so neglected when other vulnerable women who are mentioned in the agreed conclusions, like disabled women, indigenous women, migrant women, older women, but widows are being made as I talk to you, Connor. There are widows being created every moment as I'm talking to you now, not just now because of conflict, but because of COVID. COVID is killing more men than women. Therefore, there are more and more women who are widowed because of the pandemic. And in lockdown, they are facing even more and terrible poverty and violence.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Following on from this, I wanted to ask you a little bit more, or if you could elaborate a little bit on the work of the organization Widows for Peace Through Democracy, or WPD. Both you and the organization, as you mentioned a little bit, have worked in a number of different political outlets to try to get the issue of womanhood on the international agenda, including in the United Nations and the British Parliament, as you mentioned. Can you comment a bit further on the political agenda of the organization and how it chooses which issues to take up in which political outlets or arenas, and how this work relates to the broader political issues, particularly concerning self-determination?
Yes, well, first of all, why we set up international organization for widows, it's basically that we have to get widows' voices heard. Heard in their own countries by their own governments. There is the evidence of what is happening to them. We've got to hear their voices. So from the moment that we set up our international organization, number one is to actually support the creation, or if they have been created, support widows banding together so that they have a collective voice, not only to articulate their needs, but to describe their roles. Because it's also not right to see widows exclusively as PVNs, let's call, poor, vulnerable, and needy. You've got to see them as they have very, very crucial and key positive roles in their societies, in their communities, and in their countries, not just because they're sole parents looking after their children, maybe looking after other dependents and all sorts of people, but they're farmers, they're market women, they're working, they are key to the economy, they're carers. So you have to actually see them, that they have crucial roles. So that's one of the things that we do, is that we are a network. We're the umbrella. WPD is, and I suppose we're now more and more focusing on particularly countries in conflict, because that's where there's such a huge increase. So we have partners all over the world, but particularly strong in South Asia and in Middle East and in Africa. And we're trying, wherever we have widows have issues, we want them to have their own organization. They can't depend upon their national women's organizations who've got a myriad of gender issues to deal with. They've got to have their own organization so they can speak to their governments. And yes, it's true that for many years we've been focusing mainly on the Commission on the Status of Women and on the CEDAW. That's the Committee of the UN Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. And we're desperately trying now to get a general recommendation from the CEDAW, so that they must now, whenever the governments who come every 4 years to report to the CEDAW about what they've done to implement the articles of the UN Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. And whenever they come, we will actually, if we know about what is happening in that country, we will submit questions that the committee will answer. We're trying now to get a general recommendation. So we've done something really exciting just this year. And ask anybody who's watching it to go into our website, which is www.widowsforpeace.org. And on that website, you will find our brilliant, thanks to the widows, our brilliant dossier about widows speaking out, widows' resilience. It's the evidence now, covering about 30 different countries, and it's continually open. Although it's there, we're waiting for more and more evidence of actual cases, dates, names. Well, we say no names if it's going to be compromising their safety position, but a lot of them have names. A whole lot of evidence that we can take to the CEDAW and we can show to the Security Council, we can show to the Human Rights Council, we can show to UNHCR and UN Women, which actually is incredible. There it is, this dossier. And we're really, really excited about that. And we launched it as a parallel event, it was on virtual parallel event at the UN Commission on the Status of Women this year. But I'm a bit, well, no, I'm very disenchanted, I'm afraid, with the whole way it works, the Commission on the Status of Women, having been going there for a quarter of a century. I find, and this is everywhere, Connor, that actually there is a shrinking of space for civil society organizations anyway, with the UN anyway, and with women's NGOs particularly. So when we're in New York physically, we're all the other side of First Avenue in various little rooms talking, and in the UN building, there are all these delegates from terrible countries. Some of the countries are the worst countries in the world to be a woman. Well, it's not very good to be a woman in Turkey, is it, Connor? It has the highest femicide rate, I think, anywhere in the world. Turkey's just come out of the Istanbul Convention on Eliminating Violence Against Women. And in Syria, Turkey and its mercenaries in league with Turkey are really targeting women in the most terrible, terrible way. And in Turkey itself, there are women's NGOs, women mayors, women members of parliament, all the women who are in prison, the women human rights defenders, the women lawyers. And yet in the UN building, physically and virtually, last year and this year, you will see the ministers from these countries, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, with Turkey, where terrible things are going on, saying all sorts of amazing things about what they're doing for women as if they're on another planet. So we have to look, when you ask, we have to look at where else can we go, never depending exclusively on the Commission on the Status of Women, because it's of great concern to us that just this April, 1 month after the UN Commission on the Status of Women, the 65th session, where the priority theme was women in decision-making and eliminating violence against women. 1 month later, the ECOSOC committee, that's the Economic and Social Council, which has 15 member states. Among them, they elected Pakistan and Iran to be on the Bureau's committee of the Commission on the Status of Women. which is absolutely extraordinary when you think about what is happening to women in Iran, where the most terrible things are happening, where women are beaten up on the streets if they're not wearing a headscarf. There are masses of women who are in prison, and virgins, prisoners who are due to be executed, are raped before they are executed so they won't go to paradise. And this is a country which has been elected to the UN Commission on the Status of Women. So we have to look all the time, where else can we go? And so we try all the time with the Security Council to try in their Women, Peace and Security to get that on the agenda of the Security Council, also the Human Rights Council. And it's hard. I could cry. I won't cry on screen, but one cries in desperation, because even if we do get resolutions now from the Security Council, nobody gives a hoot to them. Didn't Guterres just say last year he asked for a universal ceasefire so that we could all come together as one human race to deal with the pandemic? And yet COVID has even been a cover for more and more authority regimes, like what is happening, what Turkey is doing in Syria and in Iraq. That's terrible. And when we talk about women in decision making, even in my country, women are not in decision making in some of the key areas where they have to be. And this goes back to Ocalan's writings about war, about masculinity and power and war, which is about pillaging and looting. And he talks about women's emotional intelligence for peace. When I think about my widows in Rwanda, or my widows, I remember being in Rwanda where the Tutsi widows and the Hutu widows all wanted the same thing, whatever faction they were on. The widows were more able to put their arms across the warring factions, maybe, than married women had to do what their husband said. They wanted peace. They wanted their fields clear of mines. They wanted to be able to educate their children and grow their own food. So even in this country, when we sell arms to Turkey, we don't have 50-50 women on decision making about, is this a country that we should be selling arms to? And I'm afraid the UK is one of the biggest, along with the United States, biggest seller of arms to a country like Turkey, which is completely abandoned any semblance of the rule of law or democracy, and is doing the most appalling actions in Syria, even targeting refugee camps like the Yazidi refugee camp, bombing in Sinjar, which is the homeland of the Yazidis, trying to destroy Rojava, which for me has got the absolutely perfect model which we should all be adapting in every country to ensure that we have central to all our societies women's empowerment and gender equality.
And as you...
So I just want to say, so to answer to your question, is that this dossier is now I don't want to use a military term like a weapon, a peace, but it is, in a way, it's the evidence. Everything, we have to have the evidence. We can't just talk. We've got to have the evidence. And this dossier is the evidence. And so we would really hope that people watching this program will go into our website, and if they know of organizations that are working on widows, know about discrimination, actually to send in this information. It's really vital, so that when countries turn up every 4 years in Geneva to the CEDAW committee, they are faced with questions which are based on evidence, not anecdotal, but actual facts.
Absolutely. And we will provide a link to this dossier as well when we circulate this interview. And as you said, to follow on from your discussion of Öcalan's writings about the centrality of women's issues and the issue of the masculine mentality and its relationship to war, plunder, the system of patriarchy. I think Öcalan's analysis and his understanding is so important because he shows through a discussion of the deep history how this mentality has come to organize and structure and permeate through these systems of power and domination that are now.
And that's about class, isn't it, Connor?
Absolutely. Interconnected.
And it's about nationhood and statehood.
Yes. And our relationship with nature, our relationship with nature.
And you just think, I mean, he goes back to Neolithic times or Sumerians, Neolithic times when hunting, people were hunting, but that wasn't war, they were hunting. And the women were gathering and sewing and making. And then all this, that was become when the man and masculinity was about power and having more and more male children. So that's how the women were, in a sense, captured into this slavery. I think he calls it housewiferization. Yes. Wonderful translation, housewiferization. And so it's all to do with, talks about masculinity, power, and then it's about war. And women are not about war. And the women are the victims of war. But women have very rarely are women among the people who decide to go to war. And wherever we look in the world, we see these terrible, terrible men who are actually dynasties, just like you said, whether it's Erdogan or whether it's, or you know, wherever they are, or was it Gaddafi as well, or Assad, all their sons also, or their son-in-laws also inherit all this power and wealth, and it's built on greed and warmongering. And I don't think if we had women running the world, well, we wouldn't actually be making and manufacturing arms. The arms manufacture, it's something absolutely terrible. And when you think also, we think about war, but also the proliferation of small arms, pistols and guns, that really plays a very big part in the murders of women everywhere. You know, how so many, and in a way, we've been fighting to try and eliminate violence against women, but everywhere we've seen, particularly in the context of the pandemic and the lockdowns, even in this country here, violence against women, rape of women, appalling. It continues, and guns often play a very large part in that. So we should not be manufacturing arms. We should be instead concentrating on saving the planet. And that's again key, isn't it, in the Ocalan's writing about, and some people say that the threat to the planet is greater than the threat from the pandemic, how we must save the planet, and how women are, as he goes on, women are about nature. They're about life, about actually protecting life and respecting the planet and respecting nature. We have so much to learn from the writings of Abdullah Öcalan. It's absolutely outrageous that he's still in prison. Freedom for Öcalan, we're all saying, freedom for Öcalan. But I wish that more people read him, because it's astonishing. And I have to say also, if I got time for this, that he's the first man in our written history or our remembered history. He's the first man over the ages, not Abraham, not Jesus, not Muhammad, not Mandela, not Gandhi. None of these people, these great men who come down to us through the ages, have ever understood, like he has, that you cannot have a free, just and democratic society unless you have that equality for women, respect for women.
Absolutely. I wanted to return a little bit to discuss your background a bit further, if we can. Can you mentioned this already or alluded to it, but can you elaborate a bit on how your background as a lawyer influenced this work, or influenced which issues
Yes,
were
I
taken
would
up,
like to do
which
that.
communities you worked with?
Also, but can I also say that I like to tell everybody I look like and sound like a rather upper class English woman, but I always like to describe myself as a third generation economic migrant.
Mm.
And that's very important to me. And we could all be refugees. We could all be asylum seekers. It's simply an accident of birth. And I'm deeply ashamed about the way we are now treating people who are trying to come here, who are escaping persecution. But very important to me is that my mother, my grandmother came from Lithuania, Jewish, and fled the pogroms. And in fact, I discovered, maybe about 20 years ago, that my great aunts were actually murdered by the Nazis in the forests outside Vilnius in 1943. Nobody ever really talked about it. We were only just discovering all of this. So that's really important to me, to know that. But also, I have to say, in the present, and I belong to something called Jews for Palestinians, and I'm absolutely horrified, as I have been for years, even since 1948, how a people who had suffered so much from a genocide are now committing a genocide of their own, not just against the Palestinians in the West Bank, but even in their own country about Arab Israelis. So that is something which is very, very, very terrible to me, that this should be going on. But also I want people to understand I'm not an anti-Semite because I'm against this particular Israeli government. And I think we should also remember that there are many Israelis who actually are in prison. They're young men who've refused to do the dirty work of the IDF and have gone into prison, taken out, conscripted, won't do it again. There are a lot of Israelis that we also have to try and remember about that. But then I went to Cambridge and I was taught, we didn't do human rights law then, we just did law. I think we went up doing Justinian and Gaius in Latin. I was taught by the most amazing man, international law, by Hirsch Lauterpacht. Have you heard of Hirsch Lauterpacht?
I have not, no.
Hirsch Lauterpacht was he was the man who coined the phrase crimes against humanity.
Okay.
Whereas Lipkin, who he never met, who'd also studied at the University of Lviv in the Ukraine, he was the one who coined the word genocide.
Sure, I've heard this name before.
Hirsch Lauterpacht, my old teacher, born in the Ukraine, who then became a professor at Cambridge, who said, genocide is about the group. What about the individual? And somehow Hirsch Lauterpacht, as a young lawyer, was one of the prosecutors at the Nuremberg trials. And that's how that got into the indictments, crimes against humanity. And so I'm hugely influenced by him. And his son was who died about 3 years ago, was also a brilliant lawyer, Professor Sir Eli Lauterpacht, who taught, and maybe you've heard of him, he taught this wonderful Philippe Sands. Have you heard of Philippe Sands?
I have, yeah.
And those incredible books about it all, East West Street and the Rat Line, who's an incredible human rights lawyer. And his own family were also, many of them also were murdered during the Holocaust. So I got all these extraordinary people to influence me. And when I went up to Cambridge, though, in 1950, there were only 2 women in the whole of the year reading law. We didn't even have in my college, which was Girton, we at that time didn't even have a law professor there. We went to other colleges for our to be taught. And now I'm really glad that there are now many, many more women judges And you think about raising Ruth Ginsburg, wonderful Ruth Bader Ginsburg in America. We've had incredible people here. I mean, Helena Kennedy is absolutely wonderful. And we've got more and more women of many from the ethnic communities, lots of BME women. Well, more and more women are now becoming lawyers, solicitors and barristers and judges. However, still not enough, still not enough. And so I just again think that the Kurdish idea of co-chairs and 50-50 is a really, really good idea. And of course in Rojava, amazing, there in the middle of a region absolutely at war, where the status of women has been so low. But there in Rojava, they passed all these incredible laws for women, getting rid of polygamy, getting rid of child marriage, FGM. There's proper women's courts. They've got the most incredible way of reducing violence to women, because they have, anybody can inform. If anybody suspects, I think this is a very good story. If anybody suspects that a woman or girl in the house next to them, somewhere they know, is maybe a victim of violence, they can go and inform the women police, Asaya, the women police, of their suspicions. And 2 women police will go to that house and they'll knock on the door and they'll take that man in handcuffs just on the suspicion, take him away to interrogate him. And that is unbelievably humiliating. My goodness, a man to be handcuffed by 2 women. And then find out what's going on and whether it's true or not. And then also it's interesting, it will decide whether he's going to go to court to be prosecuted, whether or not he should go to prison. And on the whole, they realize how sending the man to prison is also incredibly damaging to the women, because she loses her breadwinner and so on. So they go back, he can go back to be monitored, But this is just extraordinary, isn't it? That actually just this device of having these women's courts and women police has hugely reduced violence to women in a culture where it was traditional to beat your wife or whatever. And also going back to that, so this has now got me into something else. It wasn't particularly about widows, but although I work on widows, I work on all sorts of other human rights issues. I work on the Kurds, I work on the Tamils, Baluchistan, but also I'm working on the terrible impropriety of the UN, the way it actually sends teams of peacekeepers to countries undergoing terrible conflicts or post-conflict violence. And they're sending peacekeepers from countries which have an absolutely bottom record on violence against women. And I'm in the middle now of trying to get something done, because just 2 weeks ago, a team from Sri Lanka, peacekeepers, was sent to Mali, even though in 2015, they were sent to Haiti, and then it was discovered that many of them, I think 148 of them, were running a sex ring with boys as young as 9, girls as young as 12. And they were expelled and sent back to Sri Lanka. But not one of those men was ever prosecuted or even dismissed from the services. And now they've been sent to Mali. And we're trying to, we've taken it up with the UN Special Rapporteur on Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict. She's a wonderful woman called Pramila Patton, and with Jane Connors, who's the UN Commissioner of Victims Commissioner. But they say in Mali, well, they've been vetted. We want to know, how have they been vetted? what have they just done 1 hour on gender training and they've ticked the box? But you know, I have a wonderful woman called Sanam Andalini who runs ICANN in Washington, but she's also the part-time director at LSE, or Women, Peace and Security. And in her inaugural lecture at LSE 2 years ago, she actually advocated for an all-woman peacekeeping force, peacekeepers, because what is happening in so many of these countries, they go into these countries and the women and girls are hungry, they're destitute. And of course, there's what they call transactional sex between the peacekeepers and these women. And then I think about India. India is doing the most appalling human rights violations and violence against women in Kashmir. They've also been sent to the Congo as peacekeepers. How can you send peacekeepers from a country where it's almost traditional to see women as subhuman? You can rape them, you can beat them up, you can kill them. How can they possibly send people with so little scrutiny or vetting to countries where women are so desperate? So we've got a long way to go to get it right. And as I say, the Kurdish way of the co-chairs and everything that happens for women, it's such a good model that they're there in every single decision-making body, in every company, in every organization. There'll be equal men and women. And that's not just at the top, going right down to the grassroots, going down to the villages, going down to the countryside. And also what is so wonderful about the Kurdish model, it's not about the Kurds, it's about everyone. Absolutely. And so now the Kurdish language, which was completely forbidden for years, in there, the 3 languages now, Kurdish, Arabic, and Assyrian. And everyone is part of it, whether they're Arabs or Assyrians or Druze or Turkoman. It's about the freedom of belief and respect for each other's cultures. It's not getting rid of it, it's actually respecting each other and also taking pride in diversity in all its rich in enriching ways.
Absolutely. Well, this is a good segue. I wanted to ask you, as we've been discussing, you have been a longtime friend and supporter of the Kurds, and in particular on women's issues. So I wanted to ask you how you became acquainted with the Kurdish movement, and a bit about your work and relationship with the Kurds, and then also, as we've been discussing, how your encounter with the ideas of Öcalan and the Kurdish women's movement, how that has inspired you and influenced the development of your work concerning widows.
Well, let me tell you, Connor, that I hadn't really thought about the Kurds at all. But up till 2010, we had something called the Women's National Commission. The Tories got rid of it in 2010, which is also another way in which we're breaching our obligations, because it was our institutional mechanism for women. And we now only have something called the UK Women's Alliance, but it's not based on legislation. So it doesn't really comply with what our obligations are. But at some point, because Kurdish Human Rights Project, it was called, the Kurdish Human Rights Project.
Yes.
Kerim Yildiz.
Yes.
They got hold of the Women's National Commission to ask if they had anyone there who was a lawyer who would like to help them or work with them. And that came to me. So again, a bit like knowing something about widows, I knew a little bit. It suddenly thought, it sort of clicked. And so I went to work for them. And that was how I first got to Turkey. And I remember that was the first time I met this amazing, wonderful, and now of course she's got masses of prosecutions against her, Erin Keskin, that wonderful woman lawyer who's Turkish. She's not a Kurd, but she's done all these cases. And she's now also one of the lawyers who got, hundreds of years of prison sentences looming. She's being prosecuted for saying that she's a member of a terrorist organization simply because she's defending these people. So the first time I went to Turkey, it was over when she was, it was about rape. It was about rape by police, by village guards. They didn't think anybody would dare to talk about it. But then there was this incredible case and all these women came forward. And that was the first time I went to Turkey. And then I kept going over the last, I suppose it must be about 20 years now, maybe 20 or 15 years. I've been going a lot to elections. I've been monitoring elections. And also I've been going very often to observe the trials. As a barrister, I'm a door tenant of Human Rights Chambers, 9 Bedford Walk. So whenever I went to a trial, I would report on it on their international law blog. So there's no point in going and observing if you're not going to do something with it and get it out there. So I went to Turkey a lot, and I just absolutely loved it. And I've been to all over Turkey and all over the southeast. I've been to Van and Batman, and I've often been in Diyarbakir. And also I went straight after the terrible, was that 2015? Cizre and Sur. We went right there. I went with 2 other people. I went with Melanie Gingle, who you know, and Shahar Basarani, who was a doctor. And we went then straight after the terrible, terrible destruction and the killing of all those people, including children. And so then I became more and more. Then I went to Rojava twice. Now that was a real revelation. I mean, if I could go there now, although, as I say, I'm 89 years old, I'd love to be there right now, doing whatever I could and talking and learning. I wish I could be in Rojava now. And that was just extraordinary to see for myself. Also, it was incredibly moving because we went to the cemeteries where the martyrs were, and we talked to the mothers whose daughters had been killed, who were also so astonishing. These women were so proud of their daughters, although they had lost them. And we talked always, whenever we were in Turkey, we always talked to the Saturday mothers. And that wonderful woman who's about my age, or maybe who was actually beaten up by the police when they actually protested. They're brilliant Saturday mothers who are now not allowed to protest anymore. And they're all there with their pictures of their sons, about all that disappeared, not knowing what happened to their sons, asking. So I just, and whenever Conor now, having been in Rojava only twice, and it was absolutely extraordinary to go to all these different things, to go to all these meetings and to see the confidence of women in which they're talking and speaking and organizing and helping. And then when I'm in Washington, I've talked to Sina Mohammed, who actually came from Afrin, find out what's happening right now in Afrin. It's happening right now, Kobani, Afrin, and what's happening in Rojava. So whenever I have an opportunity, when I was talking about my Women UK Alliance, about CEDAW and our government and what we're doing about women here, whenever I get a chance, I talk about Rojava. They say, oh, there she goes again. She's talking about Rojava. But they are beginning. I don't go ANSS. That's too much, about Democratic Confederation and the A. I just talk about it as Rojava. They remember. They said, oh, there she goes again. But they're beginning to know, because it has to be known. It's such an extraordinary miracle, the women's revolution. And when I asked the women in the YPJ, by the way, we are terrible. If we have come back from being with the YPG or the YPJ, we're actually put in prison. There's that wonderful Jamie Jameson, who actually killed himself because he came back and he got to Folkestone and they arrested him as working for terrorists. Every now and then I send the Attorney General here, I never get an answer, a picture of me with the YPJ, the Women's Defence Unit, and I say, where is equality under the law? Why aren't I hearing the boots on the steps and the knock at the door? Why aren't you arresting me? Because that is unbelievable that we should be so supportive of Turkey. Not only do we sell arms and just on a massive trade deal, but we also regard as terrorists. We do Turkey's dirty work here through our anti-terror act, actually imprisoning people who've actually gone out there. And I just want to say,
continuing the war against the
young
PKK
women
as well.
The young women in the YPJ, well, what do they want to do? Did they want to be doctors, lawyers, artists, whatever? They say, now we're here to defend Rojava. We're not even thinking about that. They're just incredible, the wonderful way that they're all behind it. And that's interesting. When I say to them, but where do all your ideas come from? Thinking they'd say, but I've always thought about equality. They say they come from Ocalan, all their ideas about that. He is their leader. And you see, there won't be peace. There's no one to negotiate the peace until he's out and we can hear him. And we must see freedom for Ocalan. Really, that is so important. And we don't even know, I think, what his state of health is or how he is. We don't know. But that's how I got into it, going to Rojava, being so often with Demirtas, also wonderful people like Leyla Gulen, who's also in prison again, who did that incredible long hunger strike and nearly died. And then I've got Ilhan Komak, the wonderful young man who's a poet, who's in his 27th year in prison, taken when he was 22. All the political prisoners have to be released. So I'll do anything as long as I've got breath in my body. I'll go on, because it's the Kurdish model that we have to actually promote, not wherever we can. And we have to look, I think, in our own government here for some of the nicer people in the government, because we're not going to see, I think, a change of government in the next election, I fear. So we've got to try and find people who understand this. And there are a few younger Tory MPs who I think may be becoming disenchanted with the terrible lot we have at number 10 at the moment.
Thank you. As a final topic, I wanted to ask you, as we've been discussing this whole time, really, about your view of the general situation now, in particular concerning women's issues and widowhood. And I want to ask you, in particular, why you think other women's organizations have not taken up the issue of widowhood to a greater extent, and what you think are the greatest obstacles facing this work today.
Very, very good questions. We don't really understand why there is such reluctance anyway, apart from other women's organizations. We can't understand. I'm often asked this. Why is there such reluctance to take up this issue and show it for what it is? And some people say to me, oh, well, it's because if countries really had to count their widows, because one of the things is we don't know how many, well, there are 248 million, we don't know. Oh, they'd have to give them all pensions. Is it just because they don't want to count their widows because they have to give them pensions? Or is it because in some of the countries we work at in Africa and South Asia, again, Ocalan will talk about that. I mean, the power of religions, the conservative leaders of all the religions, whether they're Buddhist or Hindu or Muslim or Christian, there's a great power, masculine power in religion. And maybe They don't want to upset the elders, who are the people who are the custodians of these very misogynist ideas. And then the other question, why doesn't UN Women take it up? I mean, you know, goodness, we shout long enough. And they'll take up all these other women, like disabled, indigenous, HIV and AIDS, migrants, you know, whatever, and they asylum seekers. They won't take up widows. So, you know, goodness knows. I mean, I'm glad to be talking here because we don't know. Why don't women's organizations take it up? Well, because women's organizations have got so much to deal with gender issues generally. And I mean, it's interesting that older women, which always get a mention, and I am an older woman, and I'm actually quite irritated by it because they get a mention and they've got a lot of much greater resources than we have. I mean, I just start this and it runs my kitchen, basically. We depend upon voluntary donations. I mean, you know, we don't have a great big building with lots of, you know, floors and lots of machines. It's just we are working like mad with our partners. But the older women have many resources. The AARP, that's the Association of Retired People in America, it's much wealthier. So they've got a huge amount. They've got a general recommendation from the CEDAW. They somehow, with America, they've got a lot of Grey Panthers and women in America. It's very, very strong. And we haven't got that. We haven't got anything like that. We've got a new organization in America is doing pretty well on economic empowerment. That's called Global Fund for Widows. I think that was set up about 10 years ago. But you know, we just don't have the resources, and we're trying all the time to get funding. And then it's really, really bad now. It's a very bad time for funding anyway. And of course, in my own country here, although we're hosting the G7, as I said earlier, we've just cut our aid budget from 7 to 4. We've taken 4 billion off our aid, but we're spending 4 billion on nuclear weapons. Trident, our Navy. I mean, isn't that something so immoral that we should be taking aid away from the poorest people in the world who are going to die, women and children? And we're going to actually, by this, there are going to be more and more people with every good reason joining the flood of refugees, which will be leaving also because of climate change, because of droughts and floods and persecution and war. And that we could actually be doing that and at the same time spending so much money on more nuclear arms. But so my immediate answer to the question is not good. Violence against women is, which we have been trying to eliminate, it's on the rise absolutely everywhere, and particularly in the context of the pandemic and women being in lockdown and losing their jobs, being stuck alone, shut up with abusive men, abusive husbands in absolute poverty. It's terrible. But at the same time, you can't sink into despondency and despair. You've got to be positive. And somehow, although the internet is also responsible for a huge amount of violence against women in cybercrime through the internet, at the same time, the internet is putting us in touch with a huge numbers of women all over the world that we couldn't have done when we were still writing letters and sending a stamp somewhere. So we've got to say that this is a plus, and that women all over the world have got to come together. And I think for me, it's not enough now to march and have a demonstration, make a speech outside an embassy or outside number 10 Downing Street. I really think we've got to be much fiercer somehow, much louder, I don't want to self-immolate myself outside number 10 Downing Street, but I do feel we need something. Once there's a wonderful story when the women of Liberia wanted peace, men didn't, and the women all came down when they were actually talking about it, and they said they threatened to take all their clothes off if the men didn't make peace. And actually the men did make peace in Sierra Leone. They went down to Liberia. It was amazing. I said, well, let's all, women over 60, let's all take our tops off and walk down Whitehall. Well, people said, you might do it, Margaret, but we're not going to do that. I have to think of something else. But I do mean that I really wish we could do something more somehow where we're not getting it across that everything I'm talking about gender equality, women's empowerment, peace, sustainable peace, achieving the social development goals and the agenda for 2030, not leaving anyone behind. This is not a little issue. It's a big one for the whole world and for its future. So we can't give up. We've got to somehow find a way to be even more, boycott. We should all boycott the elections like the women are doing in Iran next month. They're boycotting the elections. We've got to think of things like that, we have to think of better ways to really make our point known, because this is for all of society. It's not just about, it's about everybody. It's about the future, and it's about the future of the planet as well as trying to manage to curb the spread of the pandemic, which is going to be with us for a long time. And we are not together in this. It's unbelievably unfair that the very distribution manufacturers of vaccines should actually be creating such unbelievable and cruel inequality. I'm in touch now with my friends in Nepal, which has got one of the best widows groups in the world, widows, Women for Human Rights, single women's group. She just said to me yesterday, all our friends and family are dying in the remote areas in Nepal. I mean, there's so much, and in the refugee camps, the Rohingya, in the camps in Bangladesh, terrible. What's happening in Al-Hol? And as for the Kurds, having to look after all those thousands of people who've been captive from ISIS, who are there, who are foreigners, we have to bring them back. I think they're 200-300 of ours. We have to bring them back to the countries where they came from and let them face justice here. Don't expect the Kurds to have to care for them, feed them, look after them. That's not fair. There we are. So despair in a way that it's worse, but that means we can't become lots to do, and we've got to be much more somehow fiercer in our struggle to get the voices heard of all women, but particularly the widows, who really, really, we have to lift that blanket of silence and invisibility, because they are extraordinary. And at least our dossier has it there. The contents of that dossier should shock, and I hope that we will get somewhere with that.
As do I. Thank you very much. I think there's, of course, much more that we could say about all of these issues, but unfortunately, we have run out of time, I think. Are there any final thoughts you would like to leave us with in closing?
Well, I just thank you so much. Perhaps I talk too much, but I'm passionate about it, and I want everyone else to share my passion.
Thank you.
It's always a joy to talk to you, and it's also a joy to hear all the other interviews you do, because you do it beautifully. It's an honor to be talking to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Your passion really shines through, and I hope it inspires others as much as it has me, and it really was a pleasure and honor to speak with you. Thank you.
Thank you.